Today, let me discuss the essay Marxism and Literature, written by Edmund Wilson in his work The Triple Thinkers. It's a collection of essays written by him, almost 12 essays. And Edmund Wilson was an American writer and literary critic, born in 1859 and died in 1972. He was influenced by Freudian and Marxian literary theories and other theories. However, he has to be considered not as a traditional kind of or the normal kind of literary critics that we have been seeing so far. The writers we have been seeing so far were theorists in the way they write as well. But contrary to that, Edmund Wilson was writing in a very simple, fluent English. He had written book reviews and no, he is writing everything in his own personal style, not being blinded by the theoretical jargonated language. That is the speciality of the writer. So in this essay, Marxism and Literature, he is trying to focus on the relationship between art and literature based on the Marxian ideology. So as you can see in the uh, beginning, let us begin now in the paragraph as written. Let us begin with Marx and Engels. What was the role assigned to literature and art in the system of dialectical materialism? This role was much less cut and dried than is nowadays often supposed. So, in order to understand this essay, we need to have some kind of a background understanding of not only the theoretical side of Marxism, but also the practical aspect of it. In other words, like many other youngsters lived during the early days of, you know, at the beginning of the Marxian experiments all over the world, Edmund Wilson was also influenced by the Marxian thought. But like many other writers and thinkers at that time, he was later disappointed by the way the Marxism was implemented in countries like Russia or USSR. So in the beginning days, he was fascinated by the proletarian revolution, but later he turned out to be a kind of a critique of the Stalinist Russia. So you need to have some kind of an understanding of not only the thinkers like Marx and Engels, but the other Russian Marxists like Lenin or Stalin, and how they propagated their ideas as well. So he's retrospectively speaking about all those in this essay, especially the connection between literature and art with Marxian thought, the role of literature and art in the system of dialectical materialism, and also how it had been in the or it is in the USSR. So we need to have some kind of a general idea about all this. So he begins with the theoretical ideas as propagated by Marx and Engels. So he says here, Marx and Engels conceived the forms of human society in any given country and epoch as growing out of the methods of production which prevailed at that place and time, and out of the relations involved in the social forms arose a superstructure of higher activities such as politics, law, religion, philosophy, literature, and art. So these activities were not, as is sometimes assumed wholly explicable in terms of economics. In other words, we have in the previous semester when we studied Marxism, we have seen the base and superstructure model as envisaged by Marx. So according to Marx and Engels, the basic structure of every society can be analyzed using the metaphor called base and superstructure, the architectural method called base and superstructure. So the economic aspect will be the base, and out of which forms a superstructure, and the superstructure includes all other like politics, law, religion, philosophy, literature, art, education, all those. And this superstructure is influenced by and maintained by and shaped by the economic base. That is what we have the commonsensical understanding of the term. So Edmund Wilson, he says that these activities were not means these activities like politics, law, religion, etc. were not wholly explicable in terms of economics. They showed the mold in ways, direct or indirect, of the social configuration below them, but each was working to get away from its root in the social classes and to constitute a professional group with its own discipline and its own standards of value which cut across class lines. So, even though it may be originated or it may be molded by economic base, once it has acquired a status, it will have its own working. For example, politics as a discipline, it will have its own way of functioning. Law or religion, maybe it may be molded by the economic base, but later on they may have some kind of an independence. That is what he says. These departments all react upon one another and upon the economic base. So they react each other. For example, politics and religion, they react each other. But in turn, they react with the react upon the economic base as well. It is not the case that the economic situation is the sole active cause and everything else only a passive effect. So we normally call economic determinism in Marxism, with regard to Marxism, the attempt to reduce everything to this base and superstructure model will be normally criticized as economic determinism. Means everything is determined by economic base, which is considered wrong by many critics. So here he says that, but there is a reciprocal interaction within a fundamental economic necessity, which in the last instance always asserts itself. So here he has given a quotation by Engels, in which Engels says that though we say base on superstructure, it doesn't mean that economic activities completely control everything. In other words, there is a reciprocal interaction between all these, and economic aspects influence in the last instance. Okay, or economic activity asserts itself only in the last instance. So that the art of a great artistic period may reach a point of vitality and vision where it can influence the life of the period down to its very economic foundations. Simply, it must cease to flourish with the social system which made it possible by providing the artist with a training and leisure, even though the artist himself may have been working for the destruction of that system. For example, a writer, he may have been influenced by the economic situations in his lifetime, but he may be writing in order to destroy the system, the social system in which he had been brought up. Okay, he may be fighting against the inequalities in that system or the drawbacks in that system, which is possible, though we say that economic aspects have a control over it. So what Edmund Wilson says is that Marx and Engels, unlike some of their followers, never attempted to furnish social economic formulas by which the validity of works of art might be tested. So here he is directly or indirectly he is mentioning the Stalinist model. Marx and Engels never tried to control art and literature or the social economic form. Never tried to give social economic formulas in order to understand art and literature as done by the Stalinist Russia. So they had grown up, they means Marx and Engels had grown up in the sunset of Goethe before the great age of German literature was over, and they had both set out in their youth to be poets. So Marx and Engels, they were influenced by writers, literary scholars, and they wanted themselves to be poets. They responded to imaginative work first of all on its artistic merits. So their association with the art and literature was primarily as artists themselves. So they are artists in their own capacity, and they responded to art and literature in their capacity as writers, not as scholars of Marxism or scholars of this dialectical materialism. They could ridicule a trashy writer like Eugene Zouyou for what they regarded as his petit bourgeois remedy for the miseries of contemporary society, the Holy Family, for example. They could become bitter about Ferdinand Freiligrath, who had deserted the Communist League and turned nationalist in 1870, for example, in his letters by Marx to Engels. And Marx could even make similar jibes at Heine, when he thought that the latter had stooped to truckling to the authorities, or when he read the expressions of piety in his will. So, of course, Marx must have or might have criticized the writers based on their political lineage, but at the same time, Marx's daughter tells us that her father loved Heine as much as his work and was very indulgent of his political shortcomings. So, as we have seen, even when he was criticizing a writer for his political affiliations, that didn't blind his or that didn't stopped him in appreciating the literary qualities of that writer. He used to say that the poets were originals who must be allowed to go their own way, and that one shouldn't apply to them the same standards as to ordinary people. It was not characteristic of Marx and Engels to judge literature, that is, literature of power and distinction, in terms of its purely political tendencies. So, in the recent years, or during the time in which this essay was written and later, it was, of course, a quality or a characteristic nature of the Marxian scholars to judge writers based on these standards. But Marx and Engels were not like that. In fact, Engels always warned the socialist novels against the dangers of tendency literature, means propagandist kind of literature. In writing to Mina Konsky about one of her novels, he tells her that the personalities of a hero and heroine have been dissolved in the principles they represent. You evidently, he says, felt the need of publicly taking sides in this book, of proclaiming your opinions to the world. But I believe that the tendency should arise from the situation and the action themselves without being explicitly formulated, and that the poet is not under the obligation to furnish the reader with a ready made historical solution for the future of the conflict which he describes. So, what Engels saying is that when a writer, of course, with the communist sympathies, Marxian sympathies, when he writes a novel, he should not write political formulas. He is proletariat revolution, or he is writing for the proletariat revolution. He shouldn't explicitly formulate any such theories, and he is not at all under any obligation to come out with that kind of a solution. But instead, even if he is writing something like that, it should come automatically, not like writing a political pamphlet or propaganda. It should not be like that. Engels said, when Ferdinand Lassalle sent Marx and Engels his poetic tragedy, Franz von Sickingen, and invited them to criticize it, Marx replied that, setting aside any purely critical attitude toward the work, it had on a first reading affected him powerfully, characteristically adding that upon persons of a more emotional nature, it would doubtless produce an even stronger effect. And Engels wrote that he had read it twice and had been moved by it so profoundly that he had been obliged to lay it aside in order to arrive at any critical perspective. So when he both Marx and Engels, when they read a book, they read it as readers, not as Marxian scholars or critics of bourgeois tendencies. Not like that. It was only after pulling themselves together and making some purely literary observations that they were able to proceed to discuss, from their special historical point of view, the period with which the drama dealt, and to show how Lassalle's own political position had led him to mistake the role of his hero. Achilles, Mars loved for his grandeur and for defiance of Zeus by Prometheus. Guide they both immensely admired. Engels wrote of him as a colossal and universal genius, whose career had been marred by an admixture of in his character of the Philistine and the courtier. Shakespeare Mars knew by heart, and was extremely fond of quoting, but never, despite the long, length, and ridiculous essays which have appeared in the Soviet magazine International Literature, attempted to draw from his essays any general social moral. So, the examples here Edmund Wilson quoting is that Mars loved writers for their aesthetic qualities or literary qualities rather than their political affiliations. Even when the Soviet critics were critical about Shakespeare, he was all praise for Shakespeare. So far indeed was Marx from having worked out a systematic explanation of the relation of the art to social arrangements that he could assert, apropos of Greek art, in his introduction to the critical political economy that certain periods of highest development of art stand in no direct connection with the general development of society, nor with the material basis and the skeleton structure of its organization. So the same critic, the same writer Marx, the same person who had envisaged the Bayesian superstructure model says that at certain periods of highest development of art stand in no direct connection with the general development of society, nor with the material basis and skeleton structure of its organization. So the writers can stand unaffected by maybe these kinds of situations in his lifetime. That is what Marx and Engels says. With the Marx and Engels, there is not yet any tendency to specialize art as a weapon. So for most Marxists of today and yesterday, art was a weapon against bourgeoisie. But it was not like that for Marx and Engels. They were both too much under the influence of the ideal of the many-sided man of the Renaissance, of the complete man, who, like Leonardo, had been painter, mathematician, and engineer, or like Machiavelli, poet, historian, and strategist. Before the division of labor had had the effect of splitting up human nature and limiting everyone to some single function. So they were all Marx and Engels. They were influenced by this Renaissance idea of many-sided or multifaceted personalities. For example, Leonardo da Vinci, who has been a painter, mathematician, and engineer, or Machiavelli. So he had the that kind of faith in human beings. So these were the general nature in which Marx and Engels viewed art and literature. But there is a change later, for example. But with Lenin, we come to a Marxist who specialized himself as an organizer and fighter. So this is the difference between Marx and Engels with that of Lenin. No, Marx and Engels, they were scholars, but Lenin, he was a fighter and an organizer. Like most Russians, Lenin was sensitive to music. But Gorky tells us that on one occasion, after listening to Beethoven's Passionata Sonata and exclaiming that he would like to listen to it every day, it is marvelous superhuman music. I always think with pride what marvelous things human beings can do. He screwed up his eyes and smiled sadly and added, but I can't listen to music too often. It affects your nerves, makes you want to say stupid, nice things and stalk the heads of people who could create such beauty while living in this wild hell. And now you must not stalk anyone's head. You might get your hands beaten off. So Lenin, even though he was so much in love of or music, he was critical of its effect on people. I think even the Frankfurt School of Thinkers, a group of Marxian scholars, led by Theodor Adorno, he was also critical of it. Now he was saying that art and music, especially he was critical of music, that will make people lazy, things like that, stupid, things like that. So yet he was fond of fiction. Talking about Lenin, he was fond of fiction, poetry, and the theater, and by no means doctrinaire in his taste. So even though he was critical of some of the aspects of music, he was not doctrinaire in his taste. In other words, he was not imposing any doctrines while appreciating fiction, poetry, or theater. Krupskaya tells us how, on a visit to a youth commune, he asked the young people, "What do you read? Do you read Pushkin?" "Oh no," someone blurted out. He was a bourgeois. Mayakovsky for us. So he was talking about an experience, an anecdote on Lenin. He was visiting a youth commune, a group of young young workers of the party, and while addressing the young people, Lenin asked, what do you read? Do you read Pushkin?" So at that time, Pushkin was considered by the party as a bourgeois, and Mayakovsky was a party man, And so the young people replied that we will read Mayakovsky. Pushkin is a bourgeois. Then Lenin replied that with a smile, "I think Pushkin is better," which means that Lenin was not mixing up with the party and the aesthetic sensibilities. Gorky says that one day he found Lenin with War and Peace. lying on the table. Now, you may be familiar with the novel War and Peace, lying on the novel. Yes, Tolstoy. I wanted to read over the scene of the hunt, then remembered that I had to write a comrade. Absolutely no time for reading. Smiling and screwing up his eyes, he stretched himself deliciously in his armchair and, lowering his voice, added quickly, "What a colossus! Eh? What a marvelously developed brain! Here is an artist for you, sir. And do you know something still more amazing? You couldn't find a genuine mushik in literature till this count came upon this scene." So Lenin was all now for Tolstoy, and Tolstoy was born in a higher society, higher class, and he was a count or something. But he can understand the feelings of the peasants very well. So in his very acute essays on Tolstoy, he deals with him much as Engels deals with Goethe, with a tremendous admiration for Tolstoy's genius, but with an analysis of his non-resistance and mysticism in terms not, it is interesting to note, of the psychology of the landed nobility, but of the patriarchal peasantry with whom Tolstoy had identified himself. And Lenin's attitude toward Gorky was much like that of Marx toward Heine. He suggests in one of his letters that Gorky would be helpful as a journalist on the side of the Bolsheviks, but adds that he must not be bothered if he is busy writing a book. So Lenin was also not that much interested in mixing up of political activity with that of the literary activity. So next come another prominent Russian leader, Russian Marxist leader, Trotsky. So you may know that if you know historical and political uh, you know a background of Marxism in Russia, Lenin was the leader, and Trotsky and Stalin were under Lenin, and it was believed that Trotsky would you know be the next leader after Lenin. But what happened was that Stalin became the leader, and Trotsky died in or murdered in mysterious circumstances. And many critics say that it was Stalin who, uh, arranged or things like that. So Trotsky, he is talking about Trotsky. Edmund Wilson is talking about the views of Trotsky on literature and art. So Trotsky is a literary man, as Lenin never was, and he published in 1924 a most remarkable little study called Literature and Revolution. So Trotsky was a literary man, whereas Lenin was, as we have already said, was a fighter and an organizer. So in the work Literature and Revolution, Trotsky tried to illuminate the problems which were arising for Russian writers with the new society of the revolution. So a new popular revolution, or peasant revolution, or a proletarian revolution was undergoing, and a new society had been formed, and what will be the problems arising for the Russian writers. This is what Trotsky wanted to address in his work Literature and Revolution, and he was obliged to come to grips with a question with which Marx and Engels had not been much concerned. The question of one James T. Farrell in his book, A Note on Literary Criticism, one of the few sensible recent writings on the subject, calls the carryover value of literature. So he was addressing this issue of the carryover value of literature, which means that literature has this special skill in creating or sustaining the value systems of a given society. Marx had assumed the value of Shakespeare and the Greeks and more or less left it at that. But what the writers in Russia were now asking was to be the value of the literature and art of the ages of barbarism and oppression in the dawn of socialist freedom. So we have been in a new society of socialist republic, and before that there was the age of oppression and barbarism. And do we need to sustain the literature and art which imbibe that value systems of barbarism and oppression of the bourgeois society in the past? So, what in particular was to be the status of the culture of that bourgeois society from which socialism has just emerged, and of which is still both unforgotten scars? So, this was the very significant question which Trotsky was trying to answer in his book. Would there be a new proletarian literature with a new language, new style, new form to give expression to the emotions and ideas of the new proletarian dictatorship? This was a question which many asked, There had been in Russia a group called the Prolet Cult, which aimed at monopolizing the control of Soviet literature. But Lenin had discouraged and opposed it, insisting that proletarian culture was not something which could be produced synthetically by official dictation of policy, but only by natural evolution as a development of those reserves of knowledge which a society worked for under the oppression of capitalism, of the landlords, of the officials. So even at the time of Lenin, there were attempts from the part of certain groups to create and control and monopolize the literature by giving them rules and regulations on what to write and not to write, things like that. So now in Literature and Revolution, Trotsky asserted that such terms as proletarian literature and proletarian culture are dangerous because they erroneously compress the culture of the future into the narrow limits of the present day. So we don't know what will happen in the future. We are, or the Marxian thinkers are trying to create a society, a classless society. So we don't know what that classless society will be in the future. So it is dangerous to create rules by and based on the present, understandings. In a position to observe from his Marxist point of view the effects on a national literature at the dispossession of a dominant class, he was able to see the unexpected ways in which the presentments of life of the novelist, the feelings and images of the poets, the standards themselves of the critics, were turning out to be determined by their attitude towards the social economic crisis. But he didn't believe in a proletarian culture which would displace the bourgeois one. So he didn't believe like that. We can altogether change within few years the entire culture of the society. The bourgeois literature of the French Revolution had ripened under the old regime, but the illiterate proletariat and peasantry of Russia had no chance to produce a culture, nor would there be time for them to do so in the future, because the proletarian dictatorship was not to last. It was to be only a transition phase and to lead the way to a culture which is above classes and which will be the first truly human culture. So if you know the basics of Marxism, it believes that proletarian revolution is not an end in itself. No, the idea is that the suppressed classes, the oppressed classes, the lower classes, they will organize and they will, uh, they will organize a revolution against the bourgeois society. But once the bourgeois society is, destroyed and created a proletarian society, proletarian government, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is not the final stage of Marxism. But on the other hand, the objective of Marxism is to create a classless society where there is no bourgeois, no proletariat, nothing. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is only one stage before attaining that stage. So at present, Trotsky argues that the present stage is the stage in Russia is the stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So we are going to create a new society which is not the present one. So we don't know the now ideas of that future society based on the present understanding of things. So in the meantime, the new socialist literature would grow directly out of that which had already been produced during the domination of the bourgeoisie. Communism, Trotsky said, had as yet no artistic culture. It had only a political culture. So it is not time to create the so-called proletarian literature. It is not the time, Trotsky argued. All this seems to us reasonable enough, but reasonable and cultured as Trotsky is, ready as he is to admit that one cannot always go by the principles of Marxism in deciding whether to accept or reject a work of art. So Trotsky was very categorically said that we cannot understand art and literature based on the Marxian principles. The such a work should be judged in the first place by its own law. So art and literature should have its own law, that is by the law of art. There is nonetheless in the whole situation something which is alien to us. We are not accustomed in our quarter of the world either to having the government attempt to control literature and art or to having literary and artistic movements try to identify themselves with the government. Yet Russia, since the revolution, has had a whole series of cultural groups which have attempted to dominate literature either with or without the authority of the government. So there were several groups, cultural groups in the post-revolutionary Russia which tried to control and dominate literature and art. And Trotsky himself, in his official position, even in combating these tendencies, cannot avoid passing censure and pinning ribbons. Sympathizers with the Soviet regime used to assume that this state of affairs was inseparable from the realization of socialism, that its evils would be easily outgrown, and that in any case it was a great thing to have the government takes so lively an interest in culture. So it is one of the characteristic features of any Marxian or Marxian government, whether it is China or Russia or any Cuba or anywhere. The government, the proletarian government, will be trying to control art and literature, which is a significant aspect of the Marxian kind of governments. I believe that this view was mistaken. Edmund Wilson says that uh, controlling that art and literature was not good. Under the Tsar, imagine it. Tsar means the Tsar, emperors of Russia before the revolution. So under the Tsar, imaginative literature in Russia played a role which is probably different from any role it had ever played in the life of any other nation. Political and social criticism, pursued and driven underground by the censorship, was forced to incorporate itself in the dramatic imagery of fiction. This is certainly one of the principal reasons for the greatness during the 19th century of the Russian theatre and novel, for the mastery by the Russian writers from Pushkin's time to Tolstoy of the art of implication. So during that time, there were great writers in Russia. In the 50s and 60s, the stories of Turgenev, which seem mild enough to us today, were capable of exciting the most passionate controversies. And even in the case of a sportsman's sketches, a work causing the dismissal of the censor who had passed it, because each was regarded as a political message. Ever since the revolution, literature and politics in Russia have remained inextricable. So before the revolution, there were some kind of a freedom in the society for writers. But after the revolution, literature and politics have remained inextricable. But after the revolution, the intelligentsia themselves were in power. No, the writers themselves or the writers and thinkers were in power, and it became plain that in the actual situation and identification of literature with the politics was liable to terrible abuses. Lenin and Trotsky, Lunacharsky and Gorky worked sincerely to keep literature free, but they had at the same time, from the years of the Tsardom, a keen sense of the possibility of art as an instrument of propaganda. So there comes the problem. They knew that they understood the power of literature, and they thought that they can make use of literature for the propagandist purpose. Lenin took special interest in the moving pictures from the propaganda point of view, like movies, and the first Soviet films by Eisenstein and Pudovkin were masterpieces of implication, as the old novels and plays had been. But Lenin died, Trotsky was exiled, Lunacharsky died. So even though they Lenin and Trotsky, they understood the power of art and literature. They were not, put forwarding any laws and some kind of any kind of restrictions on art and literature. But Lenin died, Trotsky was exiled and killed, Lunacharsky died. The administration of Stalin, unliterary and uncultivated himself, slipped into depending more and more on literature as a means of manipulating a people of whom, before the revolution, 70 or 80% had been illiterate and who could hardly be expected to be critical of what they read. So, if you know the Marxian terminology and all that, you know, there are these concepts of, you know, uh, intellectuals, the role of intellectuals in society, etc., in a revolution, things like that. But when a revolution was undergoing in Russia, more than 80% of the people, peasants who were actively participating in the revolution, also they were illiterate. So it was very easy for the government to manipulate and turn them into their puppets, things like that. Gorky seems to have exerted what influence he could in the direction of liberalism during the time of early days of Stalin. To him was due no no doubt, the liquidation of rap. Rap was a, as we have already seen in the before prolet cult, that kind of an organization of writers with official sanction. So the latest device of the monopoly of culture and the opening of the Soviet canon to the best contemporary foreign writing and the classics. But though this made possible more freedom of form and a wider range of reading, it couldn't, under the dictatorship of Stalin, either stimulate or release a living literature. When no political opposition was possible, there was possible no political criticism. And in Russia, political questions involve vitally the fate of society. What reality can there be for the Russians, the most socially minded writers on earth, enough freedom purely aesthetic? So there should be some political freedom in a society, then only there will be artistic or aesthetic freedom. Even the fine melodramatic themes of the post-revolutionary cinema and theatre, with their real emotional and moral conviction, have been replaced by simple trash, not very far removed from Hollywood, or by dramatized exemplifications of the latest directive of Stalin, which opened the night after the speech that has announced the directive. I think maybe it's the same situation as we are in the present India. We will get newer policies at night. So Stalin was also giving the directive at night. The recent damning of the music of Shostakovich on the ground that the commissioners were unable to harm it seems a withdrawal from the liberal position. And it is probable that the death of Gorky, as well as the imprisonment of Bukharin and Radek, have removed the last breaks from a precipitate descent in the artistic as well as the political field into a nightmare of informing and repression. So almost all the great writers were died, others were imprisoned, some were exiled, and some were killed. This was what happened to most of the famous writers in the Russian Stalinist regime. The practice of deliberate falsification of social and political history, which began at the time of the Stalin Trotsky crisis, and which has now attained proportions so fantastic that the government doesn't seem to hesitate to pass the sponge every month or so over everything that the people have previously been told, and to present them with a new and contradictory version of their history, their duty, and the characters and careers of their leaders. This practice cannot fail in the end to corrupt every department of intellectual life, till the serious, the humane, the clear seeing must simply, if they can, remain silent. So it was all happened, I think, began with the conflict for power between Stalin and Trotsky, but later it intensified. I think you will be getting a better understanding of thing if you have read the novel 1984 by George Orwell. Though I am not saying that George Orwell actually, in fact, was talking about Soviet Russia, but you will be able to relate both. So thus Marxism in Russia for the moment has run itself into a blind alley, or rather, it has been pulled down a well. The Soviets seem hardly at the present time to have retained even the Marxist political culture, even in its cruder forms, so that we are relieved from the authority of Russia as we are deprived of her inspiration. So we cannot even say that they have the Marxist political culture. To what conclusions shall we come then at this time of day about Marxism and literature, basing our views not even necessarily upon text from the Marxist fathers but upon ordinary common sense? Well, first of all, that we can go no further, we can go even further than Trotsky in one of the dicta I have quoted above and declare that Marxism by itself can tell us nothing whatever about the goodness or badness of a work of art. So, taking into consideration all this, what can be talked about the role of art and literature in Marxian society? So, Edmund Wilson says that we cannot decide the goodness or badness of a work of art based on Marxian thought. A man, a man may be an excellent Marxist, but if he lacks imagination and taste, he will be unable to make the choice between a good and an inferior book, both of which are ideologically unacceptable. What Marxism can do, however, is throw a great deal of light on the origins and social significance of works of art. The study of literature in its relation to society, that can be one area of study for the Marxian society, Marxian critics, the study of literature in its relation to society. But it is not new. It is as old as Herder or even Vico, the earlier writers in the past. Coleridge had flashes of insight into the connection between literary and social phenomena, as when he saw the Greek state in the Greek sentence and the individualism of the English in the short separate statements of Chaucer's prologue. So all these are examples. But the great bourgeois master of this kind of criticism was Taine, another writer, with his Rise and Moment and Milieu, some concepts by Taine. Yet Taine, for all his scientific professions, responded artistically to literary art, and responded so vividly that his summing ups of writers and recreations of period sometimes rival or surpass their subjects. Marx and Engels further deepened the study of literature in relation to its social background by demonstrating for the first time inescapably the importance of economic systems. But if Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky are worth listening to on the subject of books, it is not merely because they created Marxism, but also because they were capable of literary appreciation. So, what makes Marx and Engels important? Not only because they are thinkers, but because they have that aesthetic and literary sensibilities. That is what Edmund Wilson says. So, yet the man who tries to apply Marxist principles without real understanding of literature is liable to go horribly wrong. For one thing, it is usually true in works of the greatest or highest order that the purport is not a simple message, but a complex vision of things, which itself is not explicit but implicit, and the reader who doesn't grasp them artistically, but is merely looking for simple social morals, is certain to be hopelessly confused. So you know that in literature we have denotative and connotative meaning, double meaning or inner meaning, things like that. So only a person who has the literary sensibility will be able to understand those second meanings or inner meanings of a text. Especially will he be confused if the author does draw an explicit moral which is the opposite of or has nothing to do with his real purport. So there will be some kind of implications or you know things like that. Frederick Engels, in the letter to Margaret Harkness already referred to above, in warning her that the more the novelist allows his political ideas to remain hidden, the better it is for the work of art, says that Balzac, with his reactionary opinions, is worth a thousand of Zola, with all his democratic ones. So, a writer, he may have political ideologies, but when he is writing something, he should not directly tell his political affiliations. So, for example, Emile Zola is a naturalist and realist. So, he has that naturalism and realism affecting his writing. Balzac, on the other hand, was not a realist or naturalist, as a propagated naturalist or a realist. But his writing is better than a thousand of Zola with that a natural setting in there and all. So Balzac was one of the great literary admirations of both Engels and Marx, the latter of whom had uh, planned to write a book on him. So Marx wanted to try to write a book on Balzac. So Engels points out that Balzac himself was, or believed himself to be, a legitimist engaged in deploring the decline of high society, but that actually his irony is never more bitter, less satire, never more trenchant than when he is showing us these aristocrats for whom he felt so profound a sympathy. So ironical way of saying by Balzac, and that the only men of whom he speaks with undissimulated admiration are his most determined political adversaries, the Republican heroes of the Cloister St. Mary, the men who at that period, 1830 to 1836, truly represented the popular masses. Nor does it matter necessarily in a work of art whether the characters are shown engaged in a conflict which illustrates the larger conflicts of society or in one which from that point of view is trivial. So in art, it is quite obvious in music, but is also true in literature. A sort of law of moral interchangeability prevails. We may transpose the actions and the sentiments that move us into terms of whatever we do or are ourselves. Real genius of moral insight is a motto which will start any engine. So a real genius, a real writer will be able to talk about any it will be a kind of a motto which will be able to start any engine. When Marcel Proust, in his wonderful chapter on the death of the novelist Bergotte, speaks of those moral obligations which impose themselves in spite of everything and which seem to come through to humanity from some source outside its wretched self. He is describing a kind of duty which he felt only in connection with the literary works which he performed in his dark and fetid room. Yet he speaks for every moral, aesthetic, or intellectual passion which holds the experiences of the world in contempt. And the hero of Thornton Wilder's Heaven is My Destination, the traveling salesman who tries to save souls in the smoking car and writes Bible text on hotel blotters, is something more than a symptom of Thornton Wilder's religious tendencies. He is the type of old saints who begin absurdly, and Wilder's story would be as true of the socialist Upton Sinclair of the Christian George Bush. So you may have seen that people writing on the toilet, about their party, slogans, things like that on the road, on the electric post, everywhere. So that is not the way it should be. Nor does it necessarily matter the moral effect of a work of literature, whether the forces of bravery or virtue with which we identify ourselves are victorious or are vanquished in the end. So I may be believing in one value, but that doesn't mean that in a novel written by me should at the end my value should be asserted like that as a victorious thing. In Hemingway's story, The Undefeated, the old bullfighter who figures as the hero is actually humiliated and killed, but his courage has itself been a victory. So he is coming out with an example of Hemingway's. So in the story, at the end, the hero is humiliated and killed. But that doesn't mean that his ideas are not being asserted in the novel, in the work. It is true, as Kashkin, the Soviet critic, has said, the Hemingway has written much about decadence, but in order to write tellingly about death, you have to have the principle of life, and those that have it will make it felt in spite of everything. So the leftist critic with no literary competence is always trying to measure works of literature by tests which have no validity in that field. So there are so many leftist critics. They're trying to value literature, but they didn't have that aesthetic sensibility and all that. And one of his favorite occupation is giving specific directions and working out diagrams for the construction of ideal masses books. So you should write like this, you should write like that, the character should be like this. These are the rules that he will be giving. Such formulas are of course perfectly futile. The rules observed in any given school of art become apparent not before but after the actual work of art have been produced, as we were reminded by Bertrand Russell at the time of the humanist controversy. The aesthetic laws involved in Greek tragedy were not formulated by Aristotle until at least half a century after Euripides and Sophocles were dead. So you know that we have already studied, Aristotle's theory of poetry, the theory of tragedy, definition of tragedy. It is not we know that Sophocles didn't write the tragedy, uh, uh, or Achilles didn't write their tragedy after reading Aristotle, but on the vice versa. Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and all others, they wrote their tragedies, and later they died, and only after half a century that Aristotle emerged on the scene. So you cannot have a rule in the beginning and then start writing, not like that. First of all, you write a novel, and once it becomes successful, critics will come out with some kind of understanding or observations on how that writer made it that possible. That kind of the way in which a criticism emerges. So you cannot write after following any rules beforehand. And the behavior of the Marxist critic has been precisely like that of the humanist. The humanist knew down to the last comma what they wanted a work of literature to be, but they never, with the possible exception, when pressed other Bridge of Sans Louis Ray, about which they had, however, hesitations, were able to find any contemporary work which fitted their specifications. So there are critics, Marxian critics, who come out and say that an ideal work should be like this, but they themselves don't write a successful work like in that tradition. The Marxists did just the same thing. In an article called "The Crisis in Criticism in the New Masses" of February 1933, Granville Hicks drew up a list of requirements which the ideal Marxist work of literature must meet. The primary function of such a work, he asserted, must be to lead the proletarian reader to recognize his role in the class struggle, and it must therefore directly or indirectly show the effects of the class struggle. The author must be able to make the reader feel that he is participating in the lives described. And finally, the author's point of view must be that of the vanguard of the proletariat. He should be or should try to make himself a member of the proletariat. So these are the formulas given. This formula, he says, gives us a standard by which to recognize the perfect marks in novel, and adds, no novel as yet written perfectly conforms to our demands. So this is the point. No novel as yet written perfectly conforms to our demands. So first of all, he should have written a novel and says that this is the model. No, which is not possible. But the doctrine of socialist realism, promulgated at the Soviet Writers' Congress of August 1934, was only an attempt on a large scale to legislate masterpieces into existence. A kind of attempt which always indicated sterility on the part of those who engage in it, and which always actually works, if it has any effect at all, to legislate existing good literature out of existence and to discourage the production of any more. So, for so many years, socialist realism was the favored model for the Marxist critics. The prescribers of the literature of the future usually cherish some great figure of the past whom they regard as having fulfilled their conditions and whom they are always bringing forward to demonstrate the inferiority of the literature of the present. As there has never existed a great writer who really had anything in common with these critics' conception of literature, they are obliged to provide imaginary versions of what their ideal great writers are like. So instead of saying that these writing should not be like this, they should write a novel, a great novel, and say that this is the model. For example, the humanist had Sophocles and Shakespeare. The socialist realist had Tolstoy. Yet it is certain that if Tolstoy had to live up to the objectives and prohibitions which the socialist realist proposed, he could never have written a chapter. And that if Babbitt and Moore had been able to enforce against Shakespeare their moral and aesthetic injections, he would never have written a line. So nobody gone and tell Shakespeare that this is the objective of literature, this should be the way characters should be present, things like that. So if somebody says that this is the humanist model, and you have to conform to this model of writing, he may not be able to, continue writing. The misrepresentation of Sophocles, which has involved even a tampering with his text in the interest not merely of humanism but of academic classism in general, has been one of the scandalous absurdities of scholarship. The communist critical movement in America, which had for its chief spokesperson or spokesman Mr. Hicks, tended to identify their ideal with the work of John Dos Passos. In order to make this possible, it was necessary to invent an imaginary Don Passos. This ideal Don Passos was a communist who wrote stories about the proletariat at a time when the real Dos Passos was engaged in bringing out a long novel about the effects of the capitalist system on the American middle class, and had announced himself in the New Republic in 1930 politically a middle class liberal. So John Dos Passos, he himself identified as a middle class liberal, but the critics says that he was not, or he was a communist. The ideal Don Passos was something like Gorky without the mustache. Gorky, in the meantime, having himself undergone some transmogrification at the hands of the Soviet publicity, and this myth was maintained until the communist critics were finally compelled to repudiate it, not because they had acquired new light on Don Passos, the novelist and dramatist, but because of his attitude towards events in Russia. So later, Don Passos criticized the Russian communist, and then they say that he is not the communist critics ours, things like that. So object of these formulas for the future, as may be seen from the above quotations from Mr. Hicks, is to make of an art an effective instrument in the class struggle, and we must deal with the dogma that art is a weapon. So this is the way communists see art and literature. Art is a weapon. It is true that art may be a weapon, but in the case of some of the greatest works of art, some of those which have longest carryover value, it is difficult to see that any important part of this value is due to their direct functioning as weapons. So, for example, no, Shakespeare didn't consciously write any rules of society. The Divine Comedy, in its political aspect, is a weapon for Henry of Luxembourg, whom Dante, with his medieval internationalism and his lack of sympathy for the nationalistic instinct which were impelling the Italians of his time to get away from the Austrian emperors, was so passionately eager to impose on his countrymen. Today we may say with courtesy that we would as soon see the crown of his good Frederick rolling in Olana well, Job Predicious, the poet's hymn remains. So examples from Divine Comedy. And though Shakespeare's Henry IV and Henry V are weapons for Elizabethan imperialism, their real center is not Prince Hart but Falstaff. So even we can say that Shakespeare wrote for the imperial monarchs, but the center is not the kings, but Falstaff, the comedy, courtier. And Falstaff is the father of Hamlet and all of Shakespeare's tragic heroes, who, if they illustrate any social moral, the moral perhaps, the Renaissance princes, supreme in their little words, may go to pieces in all kinds of terrible ways for lack of a larger social organism to restrain them, do so evidently without Shakespeare being aware of it. If these works may be spoken of as weapons at all, they are weapons in the more general struggle of modern European man emerging from the Middle Ages and striving to understand his world and himself, a function for which weapon is hardly the right word. So even if we call Shakespeare use literature for that purpose, it cannot be said that he used it as a weapon. The truth is that there is short range and long range literature. There are two types of literature. One is short range and long range literature. Long range literature attempts to sum up wide areas and long periods of human experience or to extract from them general laws. Short range literature preaches and pamphleteers with a view to an immediate effect. So there is an immediate issue, political issue, and short range literature writers, they will write about those particular issues. But once that issue is over and that publicity is over, that work will not get any attraction. A good deal of the recent confusion of our writers in the leftist camp has been due to their not understanding or being unable to make up their minds whether they are aiming at long range or short range writing. This brings us to the question of what sorts of periods are most favorable for works of art. Which period is good for writers? One finds an assumption on the left that revolutionary or pre-revolutionary periods are apt to produce new and vital forms of literature. This, of course, is very far from the truth in the case of periods of actual revolution. The more highly developed forms of literature require leisure and a certain amount of stability. For example, Elizabethan England was a stable society, that's why Shakespeare was able to write it. And during a period of revolution, the writer is usually deprived of both leisure and stability. The literature of the French Revolution consisted of the orations of Danton, the journalism of Camille Desmoulins, and the few political poems that André Chenier had a chance to write before he was guillotined. The literature of the Russian Revolution was the political writing of Lenin and Trotsky, and Alexander Blok's poem The 12, almost the last fruit of his genius before it was nipped by the wind of the storm. As for pre-revolutionary periods in which the new forces are fermenting, they may be great periods of literature, as the 18th century was in France and the 19th century in Russia, though here there was a decadence after 1905. But the conditions that make possible the masterpieces are apparently not produced by the impending revolutions, but by the phenomenon of literary technique, already highly developed in the hands of a writer who has had the support of long enduring institutions. He may reflect an age of transition, but it will not necessarily be true that his face is set squarely in the direction of the future. The germs of the Renaissance are in Dante, and the longing for a better world in Virgil. But neither Dante nor Virgil can, in any real sense, be described as a revolutionary writer. They sum up or write elegies for ages that are passing. The social organisms that give structure to their thought, the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, are already showing signs of decay. It is impossible, therefore, to identify the highest creative work in art with the most active moments of creative social change. The writer who is seriously intent on producing long-range works of literature should, from the point of view of his own special personal interest, think his stars if there is no violent revolution going on in his own country in his time. He may disapprove of the society he is writing about, but if it were disrupted by an actual upheaval, he would probably not be able to write. So in the Road the essay, Edmund Williams, and first he analyzed the role of Marx, art and literature in the theoretical point of view based on the Bayes and superstructure model. Then he had been talking about in a historical point of view from Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and others, what and how they were treating literature and art, and then he is trying out with some kind of a conclusion here that we need to focus upon the long range literature. With that kind of literature that has kind of a that has the ability to to be immortals in in the age, above all the political and moral considerations of his time. That is the way he is coming out with an understanding of writers and writing and the role of literature in a society. So thank you. I hope you will be able to grasp this. Thank you.